me ask you before we start, have you ever had one of those nightmares that repeats itself? I expect many of us have. I certainly have. Say you have a nightmare. This was mine, actually. Say you have a nightmare where you find yourself on a stage somewhere. You're not quite sure how you got there. You very quickly realize that this is not a rehearsal. This is a performance, and the script that you have in your hand does not match in any way what's going on around you. You don't even know who half of the people are who wander around on the set. Who are they supposed to be? What are they doing here? You have no idea what they're going to do next. Something like this scenario was very familiar from my childhood nights. People of all kinds just wandering in and out, doing as they please. The script doesn't matter. One might as well not have it. And I rather think, I imagine, that the day that 20-year-old Krikor Pahalavuni woke up as Katoigos, he too felt like he was the unlikely star in a giant theatrical improv evening. People kept darting onto the stage of Cilicia unannounced, doing whatever they did and leaving again. No one was following the script that he had in his hand. He had no opportunity to say all the lines that he had practiced. And in fact, nothing of the play that he was apparently starring in was within his ability to predict, let alone to control. It was quite the free-for-all. Well, maybe some of it could have been predicted, perhaps. The usually quite sober Cilician historian Mateusz Urhaetzi calls Krikor a beardless youth. Obviously not a statement of fact. The man is 20 years old. He has facial hair. But it was an insulting expression of the kind of alarm that people felt at the sudden accession of a 20-year-old to the throne of St. Gregory. And so a kind of clash of visions, a clash of ideas about the future, a clash of what Katoigosate meant, followed Krikor's elevation really quickly. On the one hand, there was the glorious vision of Katoigos Krikor Vagayaser, which he had put into place on his deathbed by appointing Parser Anetsi and Krikor as his next successors. It was a vision that viewed the restoration to the throne of the Katoigosate, someone from the genetic line of the by now mythical Krikor Lusavoric, who is a figure much larger than life, as crucial to the spiritual continuity of Armenian Christianity, both inside and outside the Armenian homeland. It was a glorious vision. And in Katoigos Vagayaser's eyes, the re-emergence of a Krikorid Katoigosate after more than half a millennium without one had to be a fulfillment of the vision of Saint Sahak centuries before. Sahak, the son of Nerses the Great, himself had neither son nor nephew to succeed him, and so he realized that he was the end of St. Gregory's illustrious dynastic line. His Katoigosate would be the last to have a direct connection with the illuminator. And this caused him great grief and angst. What was God doing? Why had it ended in the way that it did? And he worried about this and lost sleep over it and pondered on it until he had a vision where he saw the descendants, the distant descendants of his one and only daughter, reclaiming the Grigorid inheritance. So young Krikor II, our 20-year-old Catholicos, had been raised to believe that he was part of that reclamation of the church for the ideals and the faith of Saint Gregory the Illuminator. He, Krikor, at the age of 20, carried the burden of being the great Grigorid hope for the Armenian church's future. And no matter what age he was, it was his duty to assume Saint Gregory's robe and with it, his responsibilities. So that's one vision. The vision of Krikor Vagayaser, the vision of young Krikor Catholicos' family. On the other side was the very different vision of Bishop David Tornikian of Akhtamar. He saw no way that some kind of mystical genetic inheritance, something passed on through the blood, so they said, would help to resolve the many practical quandaries that the Armenian church faced in trying to serve a bifurcated people, some of them in the north, some of them in the south, and to serve them while being dominated by Islam and caught up as a pawn in global politics. Bishop David's vision of the Catholicosate was a modern, forward-looking one. Realism required that elevation to power in the church should be based not on inheritance, but on experience and seniority. Blood and mythology, in his view, were not going to cut it at all in the contemporary situation. And so very shortly after Krikor was elevated to the throne, the 5 or so bishops who shared David's vision joined together to consecrate David as Catholicos. They had reason. Not only was David a senior bishop and a well-experienced politician, but his see, Akhtamar, had a claim on the heritage of Saint Gregory too. Saint Gregory the Illuminator was not just the illuminator of his own family. He was not the sole possession of one clan. Akhtamar Cathedral was the guardian of Saint Gregory's own portable altar, his leather belt, and his staff. In other words, the symbols of his priestly, ascetic, and pastoral authority. Not to mention that they also had relics of Saint Hypsime, that their cathedral was part of an enormous, formerly royal administrative center, well-staffed, well-educated. And besides, Lake Van, where Akhtamar was located, was unquestionably homeland Armenia. Cilicia, what was that? Homeland Armenia? Definitely not. And so David and his fellow thinkers asked, what business did an underaged, underexperienced Catholicos have sitting outside St. Gregory's lands as St. Gregory's heir? Some of those words struck home, and we will see shortly how they made Gregory take certain steps in his policies, steps which fortunately didn't work, but anyway, we'll see that. Ultimately, the Akhtamar Catholicosate lasted as a separate entity until the late 19th century. But that Catholicos state did not succeed in winning popular support. It didn't get the traction that it would have needed to become the Catholicos state of all Armenians, to use a modern term. But this whole incident made the start of Krikor's Catholicos state very unpleasant for him, gave him many moments of questioning the clash of visions, whether indeed Krikor Vagayaser and his own family's long history of devotion to the Illuminator had actually been on some level mistaken. And not only was it unpleasant for him personally and caused him a high level of insecurity, but it was also polarizing for the bishops who had to choose for or against him, bishops on whose unity, the unity of the faith, depended. And that unity was cracked, fractured, splintered from the very beginning of Krikor's reign. Out of most unpleasant things, something good does come, and that's no exception in this case. Long-lasting, intense questions were raised by this episode. Where is the real Armenia? What makes a place Armenia? Is it a specific slice of land? Is it a state of mind? Is it a spiritual reality? What is it? Or some combination of the above? And if you can decide for yourself where the real Armenia is, or which Armenia is the real one, then the second question emerges: is Armenian identity inextricably linked somehow to that soil? And if it is, what does that imply for the people who live on the soil and the people who do not, but who claim Armenian heritage? How much authority does being physically present on the traditional soil of the Armenian homeland give people to set standards of Armenianness for everyone else? As a Catholicos outside of Armenia, what authority did Krikor have? Krikor or his descendants in this line of Cilician Catholicoses, over the people in the homeland, the people on the soil? Did the mere fact of his being Catholicos give him the authority that he needed to push projects through, or did it not? And then for him personally, and this is certainly not a dead question now, what value does the past have in current Armenian circumstances? Should we be looking backward to look forward, in other words? Are the paradigms of the past things that we should aspire to recreate going forward into the future? Or should we allow the past to be past? Now, these questions were of immediate relevance to Krikor, of course. They were relevant to the church as a whole, as it's coming to grips with this new reality. But the same questions were relevant in those days to the secular side of power as well. And there is beginning to be a secular side of power emerging in Cilicia among the Armenian clans in the mountains. The Rupenyans were rapidly taking a leading role. They were a very savvy clan. And so from their fortress of Tsamandos or Zamantav in the north on the border of Armenia Minor, to their fortress at Vahka, to the fortress they acquired at Anazarba or Anavarza or Anarzaba. Nobody seems to agree exactly how this name is pronounced. And finally, to the great citadel of Sis. The Rupenians, step by step, moved from the mountains towards the coast. And in the process, they acquired a string of very commanding positions, as you can see, looking over vast territories that might not be theirs personally, but that were under their surveillance, and thus more readily would come under their control. And with this series of commanding positions, they spread their power southward towards the fertile plains that you can see there in the distance, and the vast economic opportunities of the coastal region. And the Rupenians too had a vision, like Vagayaset, like David. They too had a rationale based on the past, and they hoped based as well on the future, for developing their base, for persuading people to follow their leadership. The Rupenians traced their lineage to Armenia's last legitimate king, Gagik II, Bagratuni, who, even though he was a teenager when he came to the throne in Ani, even though the handwriting was already on the wall, more than the handwriting was on the wall, the troops were at the gates to claim the city for the Byzantines. Even when they had already taken it by force and carried him off, he refused to renounce his right to rule or his claim to the city. And there are wonderful stories about how Gagik, even when he had been finally dispossessed, continued to make himself a thorn in the side of the Byzantines in Anatolia. And the Rupenians, claiming descent from him, felt that his stubborn refusal to give in, to admit defeat, his stubborn refusal to stop fighting for what he believed was his right, that same stubbornness ran in their own veins as well. And so as they began to plot a strategy for acquiring, or in their view, reacquiring royal power, this time it would not be royal power in the Armenian homeland, but it would be royal power in Cilicia, they had an interest in making sure that the politics of the secular world, which they intended to rule, and the policies of the church were working together, hand in hand. In other words, they envisioned themselves as the heirs of Armenia's royal throne, working hand in hand with Grigor, who was a descendant of the Illuminator, just in the same way that the Pahlavunis and the Arshagunis had worked together centuries earlier. The ancient paradigm would be revived, church and state together would cooperate once again to raise their nation to greatness. And so we find that the Rupenians are from time to time running onto and then running off of Catholicos Grigor's stage. They weren't a malevolent presence. They weren't just coming on to be disruptive, but they were reading from a little bit different script than he was. And the Catholicos say ultimately wouldn't, in fact, it really couldn't, fully buy into the Rupenian storyline. Because not unlike some of the Arshagunis in ancient days, the Rupenians were Lusa Vorchagan by faith, but their moral life left a lot to be desired. But that's another story. In fact, that's several other stories. The Rupenian prince in Krikor's day was Leo I, Levon Arachin. And here the story gets interesting because Levon's wife was a sister of Baldwin de Bourg, who was, as you may remember, the king of Jerusalem and the father, the wife or the husband of Queen Morphia, the Armenian, and thus the father of Queen Melisande. This meant that Leo, Levon, was Queen Melisande's uncle-in-law. And so the kingdom of Jerusalem and the principality of the Rupenians had a pretty close relationship. And that relationship was something that Levon nurtured because it boded well for a royal future for the Rupenian clan. It also meant that Levon was going to be much more involved than he might have liked in the family dramas of Melisande's sisters. But that again is a tale for another time. For both the Rupenians and the Pahlavunis, life and faith were complicated by a need that both of them had to relate to Roman Catholicism. They had to find a way to sync themselves to whatever degree with the culture of the Crusaders. Leo had to do it as a matter of his marriage. How Latin, how Roman Catholic were the Rupenians willing to become in order to gain the support of their royal in-laws? That's a serious question. You had to think about that, consider it, and there are going to be different answers given all along the way, although in the end, the Rupenians will personally retain their Armenian Christianity. For the Catholicos, there's the same question, but for a different reason. For Krikor, the question of how to pursue closer ties with the Latins, how to manufacture or nurture or create a closer relationship with the Crusaders, with the Europeans in the Middle East, was a question of church security. Not only did Krikor not enjoy the support of all of his bishops, but there was growing instability in the area of Kesun, where the Catholicosate was located, that put the safety of the Catholicosate in jeopardy. So much so that in around the 6th year of his Catholicosate, in his late 20s, Krikor was forced to relocate. Bearing in mind the criticisms that had been made against him by Bishop David of Achtamar, he did hope and work and try and plan to move the Catholicosate to Ani, which was then under Turkish control. In other words, he contemplated seriously taking the Catholicosate back to Armenia proper. But in the end, he was unable to work out the details with the Seljuk rulers of the area. And so he remained in Cilicia, finding for himself what seemed to be a more secure location at a fortress just inside the expanding boundaries of the Crusader Principality or the Crusader County of Edessa. And you can see on the map, Edessa is marked with a star, and the original lands that belonged to the city are shown in dark red. But very quickly, the Crusader government in Edessa added to itself Samosata and Malatya. Then they added Marash and other places far to their west and south, creating a much more regular shaped piece of territory. And ultimately, they were going to expand to include everything that's in that light purpley pink section as well, giving them practically a territory that would block anyone going to the north, no one would be able to go from the southern end of Cilicia to the north without passing through their territory. So things looked pretty good there. And besides, Krikor and Nerses's brother Parsech was a military figure of importance in Edessa. And so they were able to relocate the Catholicos to a fortress that was named Zovk, probably named after their original family home. And things looked good. But as you can imagine, moving the Catholicos was no small feat. It wasn't just a matter of relocating the Catholicos himself or the Catholicos and a few officials, not at all. There was a significant bureaucracy that came together with the Catholicos. All of that had to be moved. All of the communications had to be moved. The library and the school that were attached to the Catholicos had to be moved. As we'll see later, just about the time that they were fully settled in this new place, they're going to have to move again. But fortunately, they didn't realize it at the time. So between the move, the political situation, and the administrative duties that he faced, Krikor found himself in deep need of a coadjutor Catholicos, of an assistant. And so after some deliberation, for that position of coadjutor, Krikor chose his little brother Nerses. So he ordained Nerses as a priest before Nerses turned 17. And like his older brother, Nerses was probably a bishop by the time he was in his early 20s. In other words, life didn't offer Nerses options, either in his choice of a career or in his choice of celibacy as a lifestyle. And as we'll see next week in his remarkably frank poetry, he alludes to his struggles with the cards that divine fate had dealt to him. And it seems he did not fully make his peace with his calling in life until a midlife brush with death changed his perspective on that and on many other things. But that's getting ahead of ourselves a bit. So even in this new, temporarily more secure location, not far from their military brother, in a fortress named for their home, the Catholicos really not that much had changed in terms of its politics. The Catholicos didn't have many options for support in the political world. There were relatively strong Muslim entities in the region, but their status kept on changing because within the complicated Islamic world, Turkmen, Seljuks, Arabs, and others pursued their own agendas and struggled for supremacy with one another. You could be allied with one today, and tomorrow that alliance would do you no good. And it would have been problematic anyway for a Christian church leader like the Catholicos to be making alliances with Muslim governments. That would open him to much criticism. At the same time, unfortunately, support from Byzantium was not an option either. The Byzantines were showing signs of enmity towards the growing Armenian power in Cilicia. They carried off Prince Leo Rupenian and imprisoned him in Constantinople. So the Catholicos, we'll come back to that story in a minute, the Catholicos couldn't expect any support from the Byzantine Christian neighbors. And the disappearance of Leo, into a Byzantine prison meant that the Rupenians themselves didn't have strong leadership for some years. So Krikor couldn't really rely on them either. So if we look at a map of the region, Krikor's real only option, if he can't make a Muslim alliance, he can't make a Byzantine alliance, who is there that he could lean on? His only real option was to seek a closer relationship with the Latins, as the Crusaders, the Roman Catholics in the region, were called. Just a simple look at the map would be enough to convince the Católicos of where his only hope lay. But to add to the attractiveness of a European connection, the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem at this point was under the control of Melisande, and she was particularly friendly to Armenians. And in fact, there's a window of time where there was a half Armenian woman on the throne of every Crusader state. So there is a friendly presence within the crusading community. And to get closer to the powers in Europe that fed those European powers in the Middle East really seemed like a no-brainer. You had to do it. And so Krikor began considering how to make this happen. But there was a fly in the ointment, as they say. Or to stick with our theatrical metaphor, there was a marauding intruder on the stage of Krikor's otherwise sensible script for creating alliances that would support the Armenian church in its role outside Armenia. This is the fly. The intruder, the monkey wrench in the works. He was the Turkmen prince of Mosul. His name was Imad-ad-Din Zangi. And you'll notice the date of his death, 1146. Because it's the inability to foresee how long something will last that makes policy construction particularly difficult. 1144 is going to be a critical year, as we shall see. And at that point, no one could have foreseen that a mere 2 years later, the whole situation would change with this man's death. Zangi was one of the greatest, most aggressive military figures in the Muslim world. He quickly extended his power beyond Mosul to Aleppo, and then as far as Homs, right on the border of the Crusader lands that you can see in purple. He attacked Damascus multiple times, much farther to the south, as you can see, creating havoc in the region, although he never succeeded in taking the city. Nonetheless, as you can see, he created a formidable barrier, a formidable position against the Crusader Principality of Edessa. He threatened the Crusader Principality of Antioch. And with his territories extending as far as Homs, he threatened Crusader positions farther south. It really did not take prophetic powers to see that he would prepare himself, most likely, to push the Crusaders fully into the sea, to push them out of the region. And for Krikor, it was particularly concerning that Zangi surrounded a large portion of the border of Edessa. If Zangi were to attack Edessa, the Católicos would once again be in jeopardy. And Krikor and the Crusaders were both right. to fear Zengi, and he would indeed attack and take Edessa in 1144. And his success is what precipitated the Second Crusade. You can see here European leaders meeting to consider how to counter the Muslim threat, how to recover Edessa, how to shore up their power bases in the East. And you can just imagine the number of random players that the new crusade would bring onto the Cilician stage. If Catholicos Grigor had had prophetic powers, he might have reconsidered the desirability of a European Roman Catholic alliance for himself. Had he known how things were going to turn out, he would probably have decided it was at least as effective just to throw himself on the mercy of God. But he didn't know. He also didn't know that 1144, the attack on Edessa, the taking of Edessa, would mean that he needed once again to take up stakes and move everything, move his entire Catholicosal operation and apparatus again. So as I just said, he didn't know any of this. So in 1141, 3 years before the taking of Edessa, when Grigor and Nerses were invited to take part in a big Roman Catholic synod in Antioch, they jumped at the chance to rub elbows with the high and mighty of the Roman Church. The issue before the synod was the disciplining of a bishop who was accused of murder, among other things, and it seems he was guilty. That was very unpleasant, but that matter really didn't concern Grigor and Nerses directly. And so when they got to the synod and were treated with great respect, they began to look with new appreciation at the Roman Church. At the synod, Grigor was invited to sit on the throne of St. Peter himself in the great rock-hewn church in Antioch, named for the saint. So to sit on Peter's throne in the city where believers in Jesus were first called Christians was a great honor and one of those unforgettable moments in life. And when, after this great sign of kindness and Roman approbation, an invitation was extended to the brothers to accompany the papal legate from Antioch on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem right after the end of the synod, because the legate intended to spend Easter in Jerusalem. They were really, I think, pretty giddy at the opportunity that it offered. In the end, Nerses decided to go home and take care of the business of running the Catholicos state, while Grigor went on to the Holy City, networking, making his first steps in wheeling and dealing with this new variety of people whose power he perceived as being much greater actually than it truly was. Well, as we already said, the brothers did not have a crystal ball to tell them what the future held. And at this moment in time, they certainly did not realize that a policy the papacy was just beginning to vigorously pursue would have dire future consequences for the Armenian Church and for the Cilician kingdom when it came into existence. So what was this policy? Of course, the policy had nothing to do with the Middle East, had nothing to do with the other churches in its inception. It was part of an effort by the papacy to gain ground against the power of the Holy Roman Empire, with whom it was locked in a power struggle. And as one weapon in this struggle. The papacy began to claim supremacy over the entire Christian world. So yes, the Holy Roman Emperor may have political control over the lives of people in Europe, but the Pope has spiritual authority over Christians everywhere. Now, to Roman ears, that sounds quite good, but there was a little unclarity about why that supremacy should belong to Rome. On what was it based? People in the other churches had generally always been willing to grant Rome special status. They'd even been willing to view it as the first among equals. After all, Christ had shown special favor to Peter. And it would have been unthinkable at any point in history for the rest of the churches to convene an ecumenical council without Peter's representative. No decision could or would be made without him. People were fine with that. However, saying that no decision can be made without him is a far different thing from saying that no decision can be made except by him. And the possibility that Rome was beginning to view submission to its authority as the baseline requirement for church unity was quite disturbing to people as they began to realize its implications. And they couldn't totally make sense of it anyway. Was Rome first because of its direct apostolic succession from St. Peter? Well, there was a little snag in that, because Antioch was a see that was founded by Peter before he founded the see in Rome. So why should Antioch not be preeminent? Or was the reasoning that Rome should be the head of everything because of its prestige as the ancient head of the Roman Empire? If that's the reasoning, then Constantinople could argue the prestige of the present head of the empire, which is Byzantium, should be at least equal. Or was it some kind of combination of those things? Because Rome alone had both those distinctions, its rank as Peter's church plus its standing as the ancient capital of the empire. Was it something along those lines? Why were the Romans claiming this? It took people a while to realize where this was going. But with these new claims in his mind, the Pope's legate to the Council of Antioch was very vigilant for opportunities to extend Rome's power and authority. And the Armenians seemed ripe and ready to explore this possibility. On their part, the Armenians, Krikor and Nerses in particular, seeing the warm reception that they were receiving from the Roman Catholics, assumed that a spirit of fraternity was manifesting itself to a degree that they had not really expected. And further contacts between the two churches seemed like a really good idea. Meanwhile, the Greeks, who had a lot more experience with Rome's pontiffs, declined similar invitations. And although that really warm relationship with Rome is not going to materialize in the end, the attempt to create such a relationship raised other issues of cardinal importance for this time period and forward. Of course, this isn't the first time that Armenians have ever had to develop techniques for interchurch dialogue. They had a long history of apologetic/polemical writing in the context of Byzantine Armenian or Syrian Armenian dialogues. But Roman Catholics are different. How do we explain why we do what we do or believe what we believe in terms that these particular non-Armenians can understand? The European Western thought world was very different, was different from talking over these matters with the Byzantines. It was different, much different from talking them over with the Syrians. And so apologetics in the Latin context are going to become a large preoccupation, even an obsession of Armenian thinkers. So would the pondering of such things, would the pondering of whether or not, to what degree, to relate to Rome, wondering whether a nearer relationship with the Pope would work out to Armenian benefit, led to this question: what compromises are we willing to make in order to have a relationship with Christians who are different from us? What demands of theirs are we prepared to meet? Do we, in return, have demands? Are we allowed to have demands? What is the power differential that we're dealing with? And what are the things on which we will not compromise? What are the things that, if we were to change them, would take away our Christian identity? Will the benefits of a relationship with Rome outweigh the price that we will pay in order to have that relationship? It's interesting to see that while Krikor and Nersas and others in the Armenian church were pondering these questions, the Byzantines were actually doing the same thing. And by a quirk of fate, deliberations on the Byzantine side are going to be led by someone who should never have been ruler at all, someone who should never even have appeared on the stage. Let me tell you how this strange thing comes about. It was this man, the Byzantine Emperor John II Komnenos, who had unjustly imprisoned the Armenian prince Leo Rupenian. And one can almost not help thinking that what happened to John thereafter was some kind of divine revenge for that offense. And it certainly looked at the time like poetic justice. After putting Leo in prison, a place where Leo's son died, in 1143, Emperor John's eldest son, his heir, died during a military campaign, but not in an honorable line of duty kind of death. The young man died of a mysterious virus. And so the second and third sons, the dead young man's brothers, escorted his body back to Constantinople for burial. And on the way, the second son died of the same disease. It was beyond devastating, this level of bereavement for Emperor John. And just to make it worse, he himself was dying of a freak wound that he had sustained in a boar hunt. The wound had not been properly cared for. It had gone septic, and now the infection had spread through the emperor's blood. And on his deathbed, he had to choose one of his two remaining sons as the next emperor. It's a hard choice, especially when deep in grief over the death of their brothers. Both the remaining sons were very capable. And in the end, John passed over the older one because he had a quick temper. And the emperor felt that that would not be useful, that would not be helpful in his authority over people. Instead, the emperor chose his last son as his successor. Manuel. So Manuel, soon to become yet another actor on the chaotic Cilician stage, should never have been in the play at all, but here he was, thanks to freak circumstances. And his role, as it turned out, is going to be crucial for the Armenian Catholicos. That's interesting because Manuel himself was not a religious man. But he had a serious practical concern with the reunification of Christianity, with the union of the Christian churches. First of all, it was obviously in his interests if there would be peace between him and all his neighbors. But that wasn't the only reason. He also had a vision, similar to the vision of Krikor Vagayaser and the vision of Leo Rupenian. Manuel entertained hopes for a reunified Roman Empire, Byzantine and Roman together, Old Rome and New Rome, to go along with a reunification of the Christian church. So Old Rome and New Rome, hand in hand, would once again rule the world for Christ and for civilization. He knew it was a long shot, but it wasn't a completely crazy idea. Given the conflict that there was between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, the Byzantine emperors could look pretty good. An attractive alternative. But first, Manuel had to convince his own church hierarchy to buy into this plan. And that was much harder because on the whole, the Byzantine church found Manuel's irreligiosity pretty scandalous. Plus, he kept making alliances of convenience with various Muslims, and that troubled them as well. How far was he actually loyal to Christian principles? But even though he knew that his great plan was a long shot, Manuel was a practical man. And while his ultimate dream was the reunification of Old and New Rome, the papacy and the Byzantine church, he had other irons in the fire as well, things that were maybe not so ambitious, but that could contribute to that result that he desired in the long run. Manuel rather liked Armenians. We'll talk more about that next time too. In his opinion, Armenians were not far from the true faith, even though they did have some really oddly Judaic customs, as he saw them. Using unleavened bread for the Eucharist, fasting on Saturdays, the very long fast at Lent. And then there was the little matter that he never totally understood why they didn't do it, the matter of Armenians not accepting the Council of Chalcedon. And he really didn't get why they were so stubborn about that, because he knew that their teaching didn't contradict Chalcedon's tenets in any way. So I think he just kind of chalked it up to the peculiarities of Armenian character. Under Manuel, there's going to be a flurry of ecumenical activity, and the Armenians are very involved in all of it. So Krikor has to provide personnel to be talking with the Roman Catholics, the Latins on the one hand, talking with the Greeks on the other hand. And they also had their ear to the wall in the discussions that were taking place between the Latins and the Greeks. So you have three different dialogues going on, plus some others around the fringes. There was a lot going on. And as in any kind of multi-front conversation, we have a lot of people talking. A certain amount of misinformation also gets exchanged. People talk to one another about whoever the absent party is, whom neither of them actually knows very well. And so when Byzantines shared with their Roman Catholic, their Latin interlocutors, everything that they understood about non-Chalcedonian faith, much of that information was dubious, to say the least, and some of it was just outright wrong. So a kind of triangulation took place. Armenians found themselves having to hold talks with the one side, hold talks with the other side, but in both those, they had to defend themselves against things that had been said about them behind their backs, so to speak. Of course, it did help to hone their skills in how do we explain ourselves to people who are not like us. Anyway, that's going to be an ongoing project. And as we said, in 1144, Edessa fell to Zengi. And one of the first things that happened in the conquered city was that native Christians, meaning Armenians and Syrians and such, were separated from non-native Christians, meaning everyone with European blood, and the non-native Christians were executed. Native Christians fled. The Crusader presence, the Crusader power in the Middle East fell by around 30%, maybe more. And the local European power that Krikor had been hoping to rely on, the Edessan Principality, disappeared overnight. And barely a year later, in 1145, an Armenian delegation arrived at the papal residence in Viterbe, in Italy, expecting to have an audience with Pope Lucius II. Instead, they found out that their trip had taken so long that Pope Lucius had died. And in the meantime, a new pope had been elected, and it was with him that they would have their interview, Pope Eugenius III. And the delegation, in addition to kind of seeing how things were with the papacy, had two purposes. It wanted to refute Byzantine allegations concerning Armenian faith, and it wanted to ask the Pope's position, the Pope's input on a question that was becoming very important in the mixed culture of Cilicia and of the Armenian homeland. Is it all right for a Christian priest to baptize the infants of non-Christian parents who, seeing these ceremonies being done for Christian children, also want to have them done for their own children? So the taking of Edessa happened while this delegation was away. What did the fall signify for them? They had to think, why this huge principality, this strong principality, why did it fall? And the European powers, the Pope especially, began to think that, as travelers had long been reporting on the lax lifestyle of the indigenized crusaders, that perhaps their sins had made them unworthy of God's favor. They had to think, if that's the case, would it stop with Edessa? Would the Muslims take away more territory from crusaders who had kind of lost their bearings in the warm climate of the Middle East? And so while the Armenian delegation was with the Pope, Eugenius III signed the papal bull that called for the Second Crusade. And while the Armenian delegation was with him, King Louis VII of France took the cross. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, a fabulous preacher, inflamed Europe with the desire to recover Edessa for Christianity. He preached tirelessly the cause of the recovery of the city for the forces of Christ. And just as a kind of fun footnote, Saint Bernard was a great devotee of the saint in his hometown. His hometown was called Fontaine-le-Dijon. The saint was Ambrosian, an Armenian whose relics were venerated there. So in any case, seeing that big things were afoot, seeing that there was going to be this huge movement, foreseeing that there's going to be much more military activity coming their way, the Armenians left as fast as they could to get themselves home, to report on all of this. And they arrived in February or March 1146. And you can imagine the tizzy that everyone was in. And of course, in due time, the crusade did arrive, but Edessa was never recovered. In fact, in 1151, it fell to Muslim control a second time, this time to Turks. And so the widow of Edessa's former crusader prince, an Armenian woman named Beatrice, sold the last crusader lands in the area to the Byzantines in 1150. And to Katolikos Krikor, by that time a mature prelate in his 50s, she sold this. She sold the fortress of Horomkla on the Euphrates River. A structure whose rock formations blended so perfectly with the fortifications built on it that it was as if they were one grim structure. And it was with this place, this fortification, that he helped repurpose into a Catholicosate, into a school, into an administrative center, into a complex of churches, that Nerses's name is most closely associated. We refer to him as Nerses Kalayatsi. It's ironic, considering how much he disliked living here. But it's here, above the waters of the Euphrates River, that we're going to find him next time, as we close out our series with a closer look at the man whose work, at whose struggles in faith, and at whose extraordinary vision of the divine has made him one of the Armenian Church's most beloved saints.